I watched my daughter-in-law's smile disappear the moment the lawyer finished reading the final line of the will, and that was the exact moment she realized I had never been the helpless old woman she thought I was. She sat there frozen across the polished oak table, her manicured fingers still wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't touched, her eyes darting toward my son Daniel as if silently demanding an explanation he couldn't give. And I simply folded my hands in my lap and met her gaze. With the same calm expression I had worn for the past 18 months, the same expression she had mistaken for weakness, for confusion, for decline, when in truth it had been patience, nothing more and nothing less. The room itself felt too quiet, the kind of silence that hums in your ears, broken only by the soft shuffle of legal papers and the faint ticking of a clock mounted on the wall. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something so small, a few sheets of paper and a few carefully chosen words, could dismantle an illusion someone had built so confidently. Olivia had always been good at appearances, at presenting a version of reality that suited her, the perfect daughter-in-law in public, attentive, polished, gracious. But behind closed doors there had always been something else, something sharper, something that revealed itself in the pauses between her words. In the way she would glance at me as if measuring my worth in dollars and cents, I could still hear her voice from 18 months ago, light and dismissive, as if she were commenting on the weather, saying to a friend within earshot, "She doesn't have anything left anyway." And I remember standing in the hallway just out of sight, one hand resting on the wall for balance, not because I needed it, but because it gave me a moment to steady my thoughts, to decide who I was going to be from that moment forward. I didn't confront her. I didn't correct her. I didn't even clear my throat to let her know I had heard. Instead I simply turned away and continued down the hall as quietly as I had come, already understanding something she did not, that people reveal far more when they believe they are unobserved, and even more when they believe the person watching them is incapable of understanding what they see. From that day on, I allowed her assumptions to grow. I let her fill in the blanks however she pleased, let her believe I didn't understand the conversation she lowered her voice for, let her think I couldn't follow the numbers she discussed over dinner with Daniel, let her rearrange my place in the house, in the family, in subtle ways that would have looked insignificant to anyone else, but to me they were all part of a pattern, a quiet reordering of power. And now, sitting across from her in that office, watching the certainty drain from her face as the truth replaced the story she had been telling herself, I realized something almost ironic, that the greatest mistake she made was not underestimating my finances, but underestimating my patience, because while she had been busy building a future around what she thought I lacked, I had been carefully, deliberately, allowing her to show me exactly who she was. The house felt different after my husband passed. Not because anything had changed at first, but because of what slowly began to shift in the silence between conversations, in the way footsteps paused outside my door and then moved on, in the way Daniel stopped asking if I needed anything and instead started telling me what would be easier for everyone. Mornings used to begin with the sound of coffee brewing and soft conversation drifting through the kitchen, but now I woke to a quiet that settled heavy in my chest. The kind of quiet that makes every small movement feel louder than it should be, like placing a cup on the counter or opening a drawer just a little too quickly. I kept my routines the same. I made breakfast. I watered the plants. I folded the laundry with the same care I always had. But there was a difference in how those routines were received, or rather, how they were no longer noticed at all. Olivia had a way of moving through the house as if she were rearranging it without touching anything directly, suggesting small changes that sounded reasonable on the surface, like moving my things into the smaller guest room because it would be more manageable, or handling the bills because she said it would take the pressure off. And Daniel would nod along, grateful for her efficiency, never quite looking at me when he agreed. I remember the day she took over the mail, standing by the front door with a neat stack of envelopes in her hand, flipping through them with practiced ease, setting some aside without explanation, and when I asked about one of them, she smiled in that careful way of hers and said it was nothing I needed to worry about, that she had already taken care of it. I nodded as if that made sense. As if I had not spent decades managing every detail of this household. As if I had not balanced accounts down to the last dollar, as if I had not been the one Daniel came to whenever he needed advice, guidance, reassurance. But I said nothing, because by then I had already begun to understand that what was happening was not sudden, it was deliberate, a slow reshaping of my place in the family until I no longer fit into the spaces I had once occupied. Dinner conversations became shorter, more transactional, filled with updates that did not include me, plans that were discussed as if I were already absent, and I noticed how often Olivia spoke about the future using the word we, always we, never once including me in that simple, defining word. There were moments, small and easily dismissed if you were not paying attention, like the time she laughed lightly and said I should not worry about things like property taxes anymore. Or when she mentioned how difficult it must be for someone my age to keep track of finances. And each time I responded the same way. With a quiet nod, a polite smile, a measured silence that gave her exactly what she expected. I let her believe that I did not see the pattern forming, that I did not recognize the way control was shifting inch by inch, because the more comfortable she became in that belief, the more she revealed, and in that quiet, patient observation, I began to see not just what she was doing, but how far she intended to go. I began to notice how easily small changes could be disguised as concern, how a simple suggestion could quietly become a decision without ever sounding like one, and Olivia had mastered that tone, the kind that wrapped control in politeness so neatly that refusing it would make you seem unreasonable. One afternoon she stood in the kitchen with a clipboard in her hand, sunlight falling across the marble countertop, and she spoke about reorganizing expenses as if she were discussing the weather, mentioning subscriptions, utilities, maintenance costs, all things I had managed for decades without a second thought, and then she said it would be simpler if everything went through one account, her voice light, almost helpful, and Daniel agreed before I had the chance to respond. Not out of malice but out of habit, because by then he had grown accustomed to letting her take the lead. I remember stirring my tea slowly, watching the way the liquid moved in quiet circles, and thinking how strange it was that something so fundamental, control over one's own life, could be shifted with such gentle words. After that, I saw it everywhere, in the way packages arrived addressed only to them. In the way conversations about repairs or insurance happened just out of reach, in the way my opinions were no longer asked for but occasionally tolerated, like a courtesy extended out of obligation rather than respect. There was a particular evening that stayed with me, a dinner where the three of us sat around the table, the overhead light casting a soft glow that should have felt warm, but instead everything felt staged, like a scene being carefully arranged, and Olivia mentioned the future again, her voice thoughtful, talking about upgrades, renovations, long-term plans, all spoken with quiet confidence, and when Daniel asked about timelines, she answered as if the decisions had already been made, as if the house itself had already shifted ownership in her mind. I did not interrupt, I did not remind them of the years I had spent building that life. Instead I took a small bite of my food and nodded when it seemed appropriate, allowing the conversation to move forward without resistance. Because resistance would have slowed her down, and I needed her to move freely. To believe there were no obstacles in her path. It was in those moments, the ones that would seem insignificant to anyone else, that her true intentions became clearer, not through grand gestures or obvious actions, but through the quiet confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already secured. She began to speak more openly when she thought I was not paying attention, her voice lower but not cautious, discussing figures, timelines, possibilities, and I realized that she was no longer testing boundaries, she was expanding them. Daniel followed her lead without question, not because he intended harm, but because it was easier, because it required less thought, and because somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that I no longer needed to be included in decisions that affected everything around me, and so I continued exactly as I had decided months before. I listened, I observed, I allowed each small shift to settle into place without interference, because the more natural it felt to them, the more complete the picture would become, and I understood that what I was witnessing was not just a change in behavior, but the unfolding of a plan that relied entirely on one assumption, that I was no longer capable of understanding what was happening right in front of me. There was a time when every decision in that house passed through me, not because I demanded it, but because I understood how everything fit together, how one small change could ripple into something larger, how a misplaced number or a rushed signature could cost more than anyone expected, and I learned those lessons long before Olivia ever stepped through our front door. Long before Daniel grew into the man who now sat across from me nodding at plans he did not fully examine. My husband used to say that I had a mind for details, that I could see the shape of things before they fully formed, and for years that had been enough to build a life that felt stable, predictable, secure, a life where nothing slipped through unnoticed, where every account balanced and every decision carried intention. After he passed, that structure did not disappear overnight, it remained quietly in place. Held together by habits I had practiced for decades, habits Olivia never saw because she arrived at the end of the story, not the beginning, and she mistook the calm surface for emptiness, the absence of visible effort for the absence of substance. I would sit in the living room in the late afternoon, the lights stretching long across the hardwood floors, and I would remember the years when Daniel would come to me with questions, about school, about work, about life, trusting that I would have an answer or at least a direction, and now those moments had been replaced with something else, something quieter and more distant, where decisions were made elsewhere and simply presented as facts. There was a certain irony in it, in being gradually removed from the very systems I had built, as if the foundation could be separated from the structure without consequence. As if the years of knowledge and experience could simply be set aside without leaving a trace. Olivia often spoke about efficiency, about modernizing, about simplifying things that she believed were outdated, and Daniel would agree, not realizing that what she was simplifying were layers she did not yet understand, layers that had been designed to protect, to preserve, to ensure that nothing important could be taken without consequence. I never corrected her, never explained why certain accounts were structured the way they were, why certain documents were kept where they were, because explanation would have revealed too much. And I needed her to continue believing that everything of value was already within her reach. There were evenings when I would open an old drawer and run my fingers over papers that had not been touched in months, documents that carried weight far beyond what they appeared to be, and I would close the drawer just as quietly, leaving everything exactly as it was, untouched, undiscovered, waiting. Olivia believed she was uncovering something new, something she could shape to her advantage, but in truth she was stepping into a system that had been carefully arranged long before she understood its purpose, and the more confident she became in her assumptions, the more clearly I could see the path she was choosing. I did not need to interfere. I did not need to redirect her, because every step she took without fully understanding the ground beneath her only brought her closer to a moment she would not be prepared for. And so I continued as I always had, calm, quiet, observant, allowing the past I had built to remain hidden just beneath the surface, exactly where she would never think to look. I learned that the more comfortable Olivia became, the less careful she was about what she revealed, and comfort has a way of loosening even the most calculated people, especially when they believe the outcome is already secured. It started with small things, casual remarks spoken just a little too freely when she thought I was not paying attention, comments about how certain assets could be better utilized, how properties should not sit idle, how money should be moved into more active hands, and each time she spoke, I noticed the quiet certainty in her tone, the assumption that the future she described was already inevitable. There was one afternoon in particular when I passed by the study and heard her voice through the partially closed door. Calm and deliberate, discussing figures with someone. On the phone, mentioning timelines, potential returns, and what she referred to as transitioning control. A phrase she used with such ease that it told me this was not a passing thought but a plan she had been shaping for some time. I did not stop. I did not let my footsteps hesitate. I simply continued down the hallway as if I had heard nothing, because acknowledging it would have changed her behavior, and I needed her to remain exactly as she was, open, unguarded, convinced that no one was paying attention. Daniel, for his part, moved through all of this with a kind of quiet acceptance, trusting her judgment in a way that felt less like confidence and more like convenience, and I could see how easily he had stepped into a role where questioning was no longer necessary, where decisions were made for him and presented as solutions, and he accepted them without looking beneath the surface. Dinners became less about conversation and more about updates, Olivia outlining what had been done, what would be done next, and Daniel agreeing with a simple nod, as if the process required no further discussion, and I remained where I always was, seated at the same place, listening without interruption, offering no resistance, giving her the impression that her influence had gone uncontested. Over time, she began to test boundaries more directly, suggesting changes that affected me personally, like adjusting access to certain accounts or consolidating documents for simplicity. And each time I responded the same way, with a quiet acknowledgement, never questioning, never challenging, because every agreement, every moment of silence, reinforced the version of me she had created in her mind. What she did not understand was that control is not always about who speaks the most or who makes the visible decisions. Sometimes it is about who is willing to wait, who is willing to observe long enough to understand the full shape of what is unfolding, and I had spent my entire life learning how to do exactly that. There were nights when I would sit alone in the dim light of the living room, the house finally quiet, and I would replay the conversations I had heard, the patterns I had observed, fitting each piece into place with careful precision, not reacting, not rushing, simply allowing the truth of it to become clear. Olivia believed she was building something, that she was moving steadily toward a future she controlled, but what she was actually doing was revealing every step of that path to someone she had already dismissed, and the more she revealed, the more certain I became that when the moment finally came, it would not be her who decided how things ended. The turning point did not arrive with noise or confrontation, it arrived quietly, the way most important things do, on a Tuesday morning when the house was still and the sunlight had just begun to settle across the kitchen floor, and I found an envelope placed slightly out of line with the rest of the mail, not hidden, not exactly, but positioned in a way that suggested it had been handled and then returned without much care. I picked it up slowly, noting the sender's name before I even opened it, a name I recognized immediately, one that had not appeared in months, and as I held it there in my hand, I understood that something had shifted beyond the everyday adjustments Olivia had been making, something more deliberate, more formal. I did not open it right away. Instead I set it down beside my cup and continued with my morning as I always did, moving through each step with the same measured pace. Because reacting too quickly would have broken the pattern I had spent so long establishing. Later, when the house was empty and the quiet had returned, I sat down and unfolded the paper carefully, reading each line without rushing, letting the language settle, letting the intention behind it become clear. And what I saw was not surprising, not after everything I had observed, but it was precise in a way that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. That Olivia was no longer simply influencing decisions, she was attempting to formalize them. The document spoke in neutral terms, phrases about consolidation, efficiency, long-term planning, but beneath that language was a clear direction, a movement toward transferring authority in ways that would have been difficult to reverse once completed, and I could almost hear her voice behind those words, calm, confident, certain that no one would question what she presented. I folded the paper again along its original crease and placed it back in the envelope exactly as I had found it, leaving no indication that it had been read, because that was the most important part, maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed, that I remained unaware, unengaged, exactly as she believed. That afternoon, when Olivia returned, she moved through the house with her usual composure, setting her bag down, glancing briefly at the counter where the mails sat, her eyes passing over the envelope without pause, and in that small, fleeting moment, I saw it. The confidence of someone who believes everything is proceeding according to plan. During dinner, she mentioned nothing directly, only spoke in broader terms about upcoming changes, about making things simpler, about ensuring stability for the future, and Daniel listened with the same quiet agreement, never asking the questions that might have slowed her down. I responded as I always did, with a nod, a brief acknowledgement, offering nothing that would suggest I had seen beyond what was presented. But that night, as the house settled into silence, once more, I sat in the living room and considered what I had read, not with urgency, not with alarm, but with clarity, because clarity is what comes when all the pieces finally align, and for the first time, I could see the full shape of what she intended, not just the individual steps, but the destination she believed she was approaching, and in that stillness, I understood something she did not. That plans built on assumption are only as strong as the belief that supports them, and the moment that belief is challenged, everything else begins to unravel, not all at once, but slowly, precisely, in the same quiet way it was built. After that morning, I no longer needed to wonder how far Olivia intended to go, because her actions began to follow a rhythm that was too consistent to ignore, a pattern that revealed itself not in what she said openly, but in what she assumed no one would question. She started scheduling more meetings, stepping into calls behind closed doors, her voice carrying just enough through the walls for fragments to reach me, phrases about restructuring, about streamlining ownership, about ensuring that everything would be aligned moving forward. And each time I heard those words, I added them quietly to the growing picture in my mind, not reacting, not interrupting, simply observing as the outline became clearer with each passing day. There were documents that appeared and disappeared from the desk in the study, folders that were handled more frequently, papers that Daniel signed without hesitation, trusting her explanations, trusting the confidence with which she presented each step, and I watched it all with the same steady calm I had maintained from the beginning, because by then I understood that what she needed most was the absence of resistance. The reassurance that nothing stood in her way. I made it easy for her, answering questions simply, never offering more than she expected, allowing her to interpret my silence as agreement, as limitation, as confirmation that her assumptions were correct. There were moments when she would glance at me during conversations, just briefly, as if checking whether I was following, and I would meet her gaze with a mild expression, one that gave nothing away, and she would look away just as quickly. Satisfied that there was nothing to consider, Daniel remained unchanged in all of this, moving through each decision with quiet acceptance, unaware of how much had shifted beneath him, and I felt no need to intervene, because his role in this was not one of intention but of inattention, and that distinction mattered more than he realized. In the evenings, when the house settled into its usual stillness, I began to organize my thoughts more deliberately, not on paper, not in any visible way, but in the quiet order of memory, placing each conversation, each document, each action into its proper place, understanding not just what had been done, but how it connected to everything else. I noticed how Olivia's confidence had grown, how she no longer softened her tone when speaking about the future, how she spoke as if outcomes were already secured, as if the path ahead had already been cleared, and that confidence told me something important, that she believed the process was nearly complete. It was a subtle shift, but an unmistakable one, the difference between planning and expectation, and once that shift occurred, everything that followed became more direct, more decisive, less guarded. She began to reference timelines more clearly, to speak about final steps, about bringing everything together, and Daniel responded with the same quiet agreement, never pausing long enough to consider what those final steps truly meant. I listened, as I always had, allowing each word to settle, because by then I understood that the most revealing moments are not the loud ones, but the ones where people believe they no longer need to be careful, and in that belief, they show exactly who they are and exactly what they intend to do. And as I sat there, day after day, watching the plan unfold with such certainty on her side, I realized that the only thing she had not accounted for was the one thing she had dismissed from the very beginning. That I had been paying attention all along. The day she chose to finalize everything arrived with a kind of quiet confidence that filled the house before a single word was spoken, and I could see it in the way Olivia moved that morning, deliberate, composed, carrying herself with the assurance of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. She had arranged for all of us to meet in the study, the same room where so many of her conversations had taken place behind closed doors, and as I walked in, I noticed how carefully everything had been prepared, the documents neatly stacked on the desk, the chairs positioned just so, the atmosphere controlled and intentional. Daniel was already seated, flipping through a few pages without much attention, trusting, as he always had, that what was placed in front of him had been handled correctly, and Olivia stood beside him, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, her expression calm but expectant. I took my seat without comment, folding my hands in my lap, allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace, because there was no need to rush what had taken so long to reveal itself. She began to speak in that familiar tone, measured and reassuring, explaining how everything had been organized, how the changes would simplify things, how it would ensure stability moving forward, and her words were carefully chosen, designed to sound reasonable, even beneficial. As if what she was presenting was not a shift in control but an improvement, she slid the documents across the desk toward Daniel first, guiding him through the pages with quiet confidence, pointing to where he needed to sign, offering brief explanations that were just detailed enough to sound thorough without inviting deeper questions, and he followed along, pen in hand, ready to complete what he believed was simply the next logical step. Then she turned to me, her gaze steady, her expression softened just enough to suggest patience, as if she were accommodating someone who might need a little more time to understand, and she explained that this would make things easier for me, that I would not have to worry about managing anything anymore, that everything would be taken care of. I listened without interruption, letting her finish every sentence, letting the silence settle after her final word, and for a brief moment, the room felt suspended, as if everything was waiting for a single response to move forward. I looked down at the papers in front of me, at the carefully structured language, the signatures already placed, the lines waiting for mine, and I could see the full shape of what she had built, not just the steps she had taken, but the conclusion she believed was inevitable. When I finally looked up, I met her eyes, and in that moment, something shifted, not in the room, not in the arrangement of papers or the position of chairs, but in the understanding that had been so carefully avoided until now, because for the first time, I did not give her the response she expected. I did not nod, I did not reach for the pen, I simply held her gaze with a calm that no longer resembled the quiet compliance she had grown accustomed to, and I could see it in her expression, just for a second, the smallest crack in that certainty. The first hint that something in her plan had not unfolded the way she believed it would. The silence that followed lingered longer than Olivia expected, and I could see it in the way her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, the slight tightening of her jaw, the way her fingers pressed just a little more firmly against the back of Daniel's chair, as if grounding herself in a moment that was no longer unfolding. According to plan, Daniel glanced between us, confused but still calm, waiting for me to respond, assuming, as he always had, that I would follow the path already laid out in front of me. But I did not move, I did not reach for the pen, I did not offer the quiet agreement that had defined every moment leading up to this one. Instead, I let the silence settle fully, because silence, when used carefully, has a way of shifting power without a single word being spoken. Olivia spoke again, her voice still composed but carrying a subtle edge now, repeating that everything had been arranged, that all that remained was a signature, that this would make things easier for everyone, especially for me. And I listened as I had always listened, without interruption, without visible reaction, allowing her to finish every carefully chosen phrase. Then, slowly, I placed my hand over the documents, not to sign them, but simply to hold them in place, and I said, in a voice as steady as it had ever been, that I would not be signing anything that day. The words were not raised, not emotional, not forceful, but they carried a finality that filled the room more completely than anything Olivia had said. Daniel straightened slightly, his confusion deepening, asking why, as if the question itself would restore the order he believed had been established, and I turned to him with the same calm expression, explaining that there were details he had not been shown, arrangements that had been in place long before any of these recent changes had begun, and that nothing being presented to him that day could alter those arrangements. Olivia's composure faltered then, just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it, and she asked what I meant, her tone controlled but no longer effortless, and I met her gaze without hesitation, because this was the moment she had not prepared for, the moment where assumption met reality. I told her that everything she had been working toward had already been accounted for, that the structure she believed she was reshaping had never been as simple as she assumed, and that the authority she thought she was securing had never been available to take. I did not raise my voice, I did not need to explain every detail, because the realization was already beginning to form in her expression, the understanding that the path she had followed so confidently had led somewhere entirely different than she expected. Daniel looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in months, as if trying to reconcile the person he thought he understood with the one sitting in front of him now, and I held that gaze without hesitation, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a quiet certainty that required no further explanation. I gathered the documents and set them back on the desk, exactly where they had been placed, and then I stood, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve as I did, a simple, ordinary gesture that carried more weight than anything else I could have said, because it marked the end of something that had been unfolding for far too long. As I walked out of the room, I did not look back, I did not wait for a response, because I did not need one, and as I reached the hallway, I understood that nothing had been taken from me, nothing had been lost. Because I had never been what she believed me to be, not for a single moment, I had simply been patient long enough for the truth to reveal itself.